The following presentation is from PBS Home Video.
Good evening. My name is Henry Kissinger. When I was active in diplomacy on behalf of the United States, the collapse of the Soviet system that had survived Hitler's savage onslaught during World War II, the dramatic fall of the colossal empire which Joseph Stalin had built, all this was unimaginable. It was Soviet military victory that brought Eastern Europe into Stalin's orbit and made the Soviet Union a rival superpower to the United States. But as the extraordinary television series you're about to see makes clear, a closer look at that victory exposes the brutality, not only of the Nazi invaders, but of the Soviet system itself. Russia's war is based on archival footage and interviews assembled by Russian filmmakers and historians. In its sheer intensity, it provides an unmistakably Russian perspective on their experience of World War II, on the great patriotic war.
A people over 200 million strong, spread over 1/6 of the Earth's surface. The Russian people have survived World War, revolution, and a bitter civil war. Now they come together in mourning for Lenin, the founder of their new state. With his death, the people of the newly created Soviet Union are about to receive a new leader. Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin are leading contenders. But unknown to the Soviet people, Lenin, close to death, has drawn up a testament, an assessment of the leaders who will come after him. The outstanding personalities he recognizes are Trotsky and Stalin. But his postscript contains a political time bomb, a damning condemnation of Stalin's character, and the President's suggestion that the post of General Secretary should be taken from him. The testament is never made public. Despite the efforts of Lenin's wife, Krupskaya, political maneuvering among the leadership group ensures a limited access to the testament at the 13th Party Congress, and only then under an oath of secrecy. Stalin has surmounted his first hurdle on his road to power. As he consolidates his position, nobody is allowed close enough to guess what really occupies Joseph Stalin's mind. But from now until his death, Stalin will wage war on his own people. For 30 years, manipulating lives with propaganda and state-sponsored lies, controlling them not by personality or political genius, but by the hypnosis of terror. In 30 years, he will annihilate nearly 20 million people by shooting or starvation or by transportation to remote areas of the vast country to be worked to death as slave labor. Joseph Stalin will bind in a new serfdom a vast nation of innocent men, women and children to achieve for himself the most absolute form of power ever achieved. And incredibly, within this long drawn-out internal war, alongside it, these same Soviet people will be called upon to fight back in another war at a cost of another 25 million people against another dictator, Adolf Hitler. This is a war we more readily recognize, a war we now in the 20th century have come to see as war founded on myth, conducted on the basis of race hatred, with fleeing civilians, ghetto populations, and the enormity of planned extermination. But in 1924, Lenin's warning against the dark nature of Joseph Stalin is carefully concealed from the Soviet citizens who mourn the dead leader's passing. For the moment, they believe the state's loud proclamations of a new era in the life of man. These are days of real social experiment, of improving standards in health, of sharply increasing literacy. Days of hope. For the moment, Stalin is regarded, even by those close to him, as a visionary leader, capable of making the dreams of the October Revolution come true. It is a time when powerful propaganda tools are being forged. Soviet citizens begin to see themselves as living in a society more just, more equal, more law-abiding, and more peace-loving than others. They are perhaps even beginning to reflect their own image of comradeship, hard work, Soviet patriotism. In these early days, acclaim for Joseph Stalin is unforced. At party congresses in the mid-20s, delegates chant his name not from fear, but from genuine admiration. And he responds. Brand new apartment blocks are planned for his appointees in the Communist Party and Soviet establishment in different cities. In the capital, the first designs are drawn up, and construction begins on a giant apartment block on the Moscow River. The huge modern block on the embankment is planned to be an example of modern socialist living, spacious, clean, comfortable. Here, the high officials of the new state will be housed. The new building, built to celebrate the Soviet present, faces the great cathedral of Christ the Savior, a potent symbol of the Tsarist past. In these years, among the citizens of the great Union of Republics, belief grows that the new dawn of socialism is about to touch the horizon. The reality will be shudderingly different. It will be a reality molded by Stalin with unrivaled ruthlessness. Behind what Trotsky called his yellow eyes flares an insatiable appetite.
He was a very vain man. He tried to conceal it, but you understand this was a very difficult thing for him to do.
One man has access to the most restricted of Stalin's personal papers. Professor Volker Gernov is the author of a biography of Stalin, which has been widely praised in the West.
Who was Stalin? What kind of person was he? Stalin was a man with a powerful but evil mind, a man who liked two things in this world, power and fame. But he liked power the most, and the more power he had, the more power he accumulated and kept in his hands, the more power he wanted. It was like a powerful addiction that lasted all his life, an addiction to power.
Already Stalin knows that the party is the cockpit of power. In 4 years after Lenin's death, he has outmaneuvered his political rivals. Old comrades like Kamenev and Zinoviev, who helped him conceal the contents of Lenin's damaging testament, are forced to capitulate. And Leon Trotsky, Stalin's arch-rival, is at first exiled, then deported from the USSR. The towering figure of Bukharin makes a public confession of his errors. Power beyond the party will have to be wrenched from more tenacious hands. To transform at a stroke a vast but backward nation into a truly world-class power, even the ambition itself has a medieval Asiatic ring.
Напрасно смеялся Хрущев. Сталин любил глобус, любил карты.
Stalin loved looking at the globe and poring over maps. Even before the beginning of the Finnish War, he had already ordered that new maps of the Soviet Union should be published, with large areas of Finland included in them.
Большими кусками отрезаны от Финляндии.
He loved to slowly rotate the globe and look at it, and it seems to me he looked at things very much from a global perspective. He wanted to see the whole globe colored in Soviet red.
Это, я думаю, так.
And it is not only Stalin who dreams of extending his empire. Beyond the handspan of the Kremlin, future dangers loom. Italy is already a fascist state. In the Far East, Japan's territorial ambitions smolder. Adolf Hitler's Nazis are already a national party. In many German towns, its stormtroopers are taking control of the streets. With each election, the Hitler vote rises menacingly. In these times, Joseph Stalin is not the only ambitious man who reflectively fingers the globe. For the Soviet people, this year, 1928, is the watershed. Stalin's war against his own people is not declared by Stalin in a single speech on a single day.
Comrade Lenin dreamt of 100,000 tractors in our fields.
In an overwhelmingly agricultural Russia, at the end of the 1920s, over 98% of the land is in the hands of individuals, mostly less than 10-acre smallholdings. Less than 2% is collectivized in the hands of the state. Now, a truly astounding decision is taken. Stalin takes it upon himself to eject from their smallholdings every land-owning peasant in this nation of peasants. Coldly, he accepts that he will cause famine on a huge scale, suffering beyond anything that has happened in Russia's history of suffering. In the countryside, there is no question of simple reform. Stalin's aims are to control the crop, particularly the symbolic grain crop, and to forcibly dispossess the land-owning small peasantry, the kulaks, to form the labor force on the new collective farms. Collectivization is a storm which breaks slowly. When it comes, it will involve the starvation of millions, the imprisonment of millions more. Hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of shootings in dark courtyards, and farcical mock trials filmed for a gullible West, eager to believe the great experiment in social justice is being properly defended. Perhaps it's coincidence that 1928 sees the return of the Russian writer Maxim Gorky to the homeland. Sharing Stalin's own contempt for the peasants, he has painted them in print as subhumans who hoard while the towns starve. His welcome is ecstatic. But Gorky's ideas will prove the keynote to the propaganda program against those the party dubbed the kulaks, the so-called rich peasantry. So over rural Russia, the storm gathers and breaks. As 1929 ends, the whirlwind batters vast areas of the Ukraine and the northern Caucasus. In this first onslaught, arrests are made in perhaps 1 million kulak households. Heads of families are sent to prepared labor camps. Dependents are deported to Siberia. While propaganda films create cruel illusions of peasants celebrating the new reforms. Stalin's war against the people has opened with a resounding victory. Now, in the winter of 1930, the campaign is extended to include the whole spectrum of poorer peasants too. In these times, the lives of 120 million people living in 600,000 villages across the breadth of the Soviet Union will be turned upside down. Expropriation, eviction, and transportations become commonplace from the Ukraine to Siberia. Compassion is unthinkable. In desperation, peasants secrete grain or slaughter their beasts before they are expropriated. This is no secret war secretly conducted. Its soldiers are youthful special food detachments, most often recruited from the towns, and men of the NKVD, Stalin's tools of terror. Its victories are trumpeted throughout the Soviet Union as a triumph of the people against grasping, hoarding kulaks. There is to be no escape to the towns for the peasantry. An internal passport system keeps the dispossessed peasant family on the land. In Kazakhstan, nearly 20% of the population die of starvation. Throughout the Soviet Union, whole villages are left without inhabitants. 1 million die in the North Caucasus. In the Ukraine, grain confiscation creates a famine which kills nearly 5 million. This is a man-made disaster. And in the camps, over 3 million newly arrived peasants in near-starvation conditions are being worked to death. Reduced, as the up-and-coming young Georgian Lavrenti Beria puts it, to camp dust. I have seen faces, the poet Anna Akhmatova writes. I have seen faces turn to bone. In March of 1930, Stalin publishes his article on collectivization. He chooses to call it Dizzy with Success. Yet even while collectivization is gathering pace, the restless dark mind of Stalin is seeking out other enemies. The leader's anti-Semitism runs deep. He establishes a Jewish autonomous area in distant Birobidzhan near the Chinese border. He knows from party experience the thread of non-conformism, even revolution, that exists in the Jewish tradition. To his mind, the location of most Soviet Jews in the Western Soviet Union is not ideal. But few Jews settle in the East. Unsurprisingly, they prefer the towns of Ukraine and Belorussia where they are born. As collectivization spreads through the countryside, Soviet Jews for the most part survive the whirlwind only to reap the Holocaust to come. Now Stalin's mind turns in a new direction. The year 1928 has already seen the introduction of the first five-year plan. New construction begins in whole new sectors of the economy. Machine tool plants, automobile and tractor factories, and vast communications projects, railways, canals, roads. But now the public trials of the mine workers at Shakhty in the Donetsk region are a warning to industry. A warning that workers in industry too are to be forced to bend to Stalin's will. At Shakhty, 55 men are accused of conspiring with foreign powers to wreck the mines of the Donetsk basin. 11 are sentenced to death, the rest to the slower death of long-term imprisonment. Stalin proclaims, "We have internal enemies, we have external enemies. This, comrades, must not be forgotten for a single moment." The point is hammered home during these collectivization years. If industrial production is not reaching the heights set on paper, intransigence and sabotage of the workers can be the only reason. Slogans call for the annihilation of the enemy. Those who want to restore capitalism will be shot. Sabotage, treachery, plots to murder the leader begin to be glibly cobbled together. Sergei Shegelkov was 17 when he was arrested for plotting to kill Stalin.
Standing before the interrogator, the first question was, "Do you know who Stalin is?" "Well," I said, "of course I do. He's our leader." Then they asked me why I had wanted to kill him. I was astounded that they asked this. Then it began. Threats, beatings. They held a gun to my neck. Then hit me with it, on my head, all over. But the worst thing was that they told me to sign a blank confession, or they would shoot my mother.
From the Lubyanka, Shegelkov is transported along endless staging posts on a journey to the unknown.
The transit camps were very depressing places. Even in winter and early spring, we were only half dressed. We stayed in broken-down barracks with holes in the roof that let the snow in. When we woke in the morning, we were all covered in snow.
From his last staging post at Kem, Sergei Shegelkov was transported to the island of Solovki. On the White Sea Island monastery of Solovki, monks have celebrated the rites of orthodoxy for 4 centuries, but in Russia, a harsh symbolism is never far away. Already during Lenin's lifetime, the chants of monks have changed to the work songs of innumerable prisoners. Stalin's policies in industry and agriculture will ensure the stream of new slaves will never run dry.
Before, all the buildings had belonged to the monks. There were 6 3-story buildings converted into prisons. Iron bars, doors with special locks and so on. At first it was just a camp, and then suddenly it became Ston, which stood for Solovki Special Purpose Prison. Ston in Russian means moan, and it was indeed a place of many moans. And it was to the Ston that the huge numbers of prisoners were sent to serve 25 years.
In these years, the word Ston comes to signify all imprisonment in all labor camps, predating Gulag in the grim language of Soviet prisoners.
Furthermore, all the officials who arrested, interrogated and deported us knew very well that we were completely innocent.
In these camps, there is no attempt at communist re-education. The object of the system is the brutal extraction of labor. Through blazing summers and the bitter winters to come, men like Sergei Shekelkov are sent out from Solovki Monastery and from mobile camps along its whole length to work and die on one of the most trumpeted Soviet achievements of the 30s, the building of the White Sea Canal. When the canal is completed and water floods its channels, thousands of prisoners will be disposed of by drowning. But the camp at Solovki is just one among the first great Soviet camps to be established on the islands of the White Sea. As the collectivization campaign proves the pressing need for new camps, millions of new prisoners are dispatched to other parts of the Soviet Union, to the harshest areas of Siberia and the far northeast, where the newly formed Gulag comes to control a fearsome necklace of camps stretching the entire length of the Soviet Union. They are building a nation is the propaganda theme. It is a theme many Russians still believe. But all too often, alongside the great working mass of the Soviet people, they are the system's zeks, the forced laborers condemned without trial, driven from the villages of the Ukraine, the Caucasus, the farmland of South Russia, or the deserts of Kazakhstan. In regions like Magadan in the far northeast, the newly formed Gulag comes to control vast industrial enterprises in lumber and mining. In eastern Siberia, the Gulag is presented as Dalstroy, the construction facility for the Far East. These are huge NKVD-run enterprises, blood brothers in conception to the great construction enterprises and slave labor hire companies which the SS will shortly establish in Germany. But from camps closer to the great cities, slave labor is imported to build the Moscow-Volga Canal, to build more than 1 in 10 new electricity stations, and to be used as additional labor in the construction of the great subway, which Khrushchev supervises for the greater glory of the state and its master. They are building a nation. But now, beyond the Soviet Union, the first gunshots in what will become a world at war. The Japanese Kwantung Army, acting independently of the Tokyo government, invades Manchuria. It is an onslaught which brings Japan and the Soviet Union face to face in the Far East. The attack is relentlessly pursued against military and civilian targets. And now, perilously close to Soviet western borders, the German election of January 1933 sweeps the Nazi Party to victory. From this moment on, Adolf Hitler will stand with Joseph Stalin on an equal pinnacle of power. He leads a people as yet only partially armed. He preaches a philosophy that claims that his people's rightful destiny lies in the East. In speech after speech, he lays claim to vast areas of Lebensraum, living space, within the borders of the Soviet Union.
Deutsche Jugend! Deutsche Mädchen! Unser Reichspräsident, Generalfeldmarschall von Hindenburg!
Now the destinies of these two great nations can no longer run peacefully parallel. Adolf Hitler's own statements have wrenched them onto a collision course. Yet Stalin's response to Hitler's rise is not predictable. The Soviet Union hurries to give recognition to the new Nazi state. In May 1933, just 3 months after Hitler becomes Chancellor, Stalin ratifies an extension of the 1926 Berlin Treaty of Friendship and Neutrality. Primakov was a senior Soviet officer and died as a victim of Stalin. His son quotes a unique passage from Trotsky.
The USSR is the only state that does not have hostile feelings towards Germany. It is not concerned about the form and character of the regime that is in power. You see, France and England and other democratic countries understood full well that the arrival of the Nazis to power was a threat to the whole world. But it didn't disturb us. We just carried on training German pilots and tank commanders on our territory. According to the Versailles Treaty, they were not allowed to do so in their own country, so we continued to do it for them. The fact is, we trained our own executioners. So, if someone says that Stalin was the savior of our motherland and the father of the nation, they really ought to understand that there has never been a worse traitor since Judas.
Across the country, the Soviet system is able to show dazzling achievements. Nobody dare mention the devastating cost. The 17th Party Congress records them in full. Whole new branches of industry in chemicals, synthetics and man-made fibers, vast new tractors and automobile plants, trucks in the Urals, the Dnieper hydroelectric project, and ever-growing literacy levels and levels of secondary education. The Great Party Congress in 1934 is greeted by Stalin in gross self-acclamation as the Congress of Victors. The delegates to the Congress are assembled. Stalin now considers their loyalty. At this Congress, in which adulation of Stalin reaches new heights, the young Khrushchev. No shadow of his vigorous denunciation of Stalin a quarter of a century later crosses his face. He is one of the up-and-coming princelings of the party. Lavrenti Beria, too, the monstrous hangman who will serve Stalin in later years, is edging onto the national stage at this Congress. The best known are the much-photographed stars of the party, filmed, praised and promoted by the press like a Clark Gable or a Cary Grant. They are men with nothing less than film star status. Prominent among them is Sergei Kirov, a rising party star, a member of the Politburo, tough, ruthless with the lives of others, but perpetually smiling, energetic, popular. In speech after speech, the Georgian or Johnny Kitzer and the flatterer Voroshilov heap praise on Stalin as a helmsman of genius. But among a core group of regional party secretaries with first-hand experience of the costs of Stalin's achievements, the adulation is a mask. Among the many public votes taken, on the last day, delegates are given the opportunity in secret ballot to vote for members of the Central Committee, and of course, confirm Stalin as General Secretary. It is a formality acceded to by the smiling, indulgent Stalin. There have been so many formal ballots, but nobody could have predicted the dramatic result this one was to have. Now, only hours before Congress breaks up, the votes are counted. Kirov has just 3 votes against him. But, almost unbelievably, 300 delegates have voted against Stalin. It confirms the Georgian in all his worst fears, his nightmares of treachery. The papers are immediately destroyed and the results falsified. Stalin is now shown to have been all but unanimously elected, but the fate of the delegates and Sergei Kirov himself is sealed. Of those 1,966 delegates, over 1,000 will be murdered as a new terror sweeps through the administration. Few of the leading figures are spared, and for them it will be no more than a temporary stay of execution. Of the 139-member Central Committee, elected by the Congress of Victors, 98 men will be taken out and shot dead. Thus far has Stalin brought the Marxist-Leninist dream in one short decade. And now he must face the problem of the popularity of Kirov. And for a solution, Joseph Stalin looks towards Germany. Like Stalin's problems with the popular Sergei Kirov, Hitler has similar problems with his old friend Ernst Röhm. Swashbuckling, populist leader of the brown-shirt thugs who won the streets for Hitler, Röhm is now an embarrassment. In one devastating night, the night of the long knives, Hitler strikes. Chancellor of the German state, he personally murders Röhm in a Munich cell. Conducted by Himmler's brilliant assistant Reinhard Heydrich, the night of the long knives is a clean surgical operation. In unspoken homage to the German dictator 6 months later, Stalin strikes in Leningrad on his own night of the long knives. On December the 1st, 1934, Kirov falls to a bullet from an NKVD assassin.
This was an act of terrorism. One of our state leaders was murdered. A very popular person who was loved by everybody. A magnificent public speaker. Everyone was charmed by him. And then suddenly he was murdered. How and why could he have been killed? Well, when someone telephoned Bukharin and told him about it, he just put down the phone and said, "Now Koba will shoot us all."
At Kirov's funeral, Stalin behaves like a man bereft of his best friend. But it is the beginning of countless arrests of party members. Everybody who had been involved with Kirov, including his assassin, is to die in faked accidents. In Leningrad, the terror is intense. Throughout the country, many thousands of others unconnected with Kirov are arrested. The pressure is relentlessly maintained. The aim now is no less than a complete scouring of the party for anybody whose loyalty is in doubt. This is a time when Nikolai Yezhov serves as Stalin's hangman, a time which is to become known as the Yezhovshchina, the days of Yezhov the dwarf. Mass demonstrations are organized to call for the punishment of those guilty of Kirov's death. Zinoviev and Kamenev, Stalin's old comrades of the early Soviet days, confessed to plots to combine with Trotsky to murder the Soviet leader. The trials continue. Bukharin, whom Stalin has stalked for 10 years, is dragged before the court.
It was a pretense, a tragic farce. He was interrupted several times by Vyshinsky very rudely, like, "Why do you keep telling us all these fairy tales? Keep to the subject." Eventually he interrupted Bukharin, shouting, "You are a cross between a fox and a pig," and didn't even give him the opportunity to finish what he was saying.
Stalin
was supremely suspicious. He'd been afraid of assassination attempts all his life, although there hadn't been one genuine attempt as yet. For example, wherever he went, he had half a meter cut from the bottom of the curtains, so that he could be sure no one was hiding behind them. And of course, this was almost laughable. Every time he went to his dacha, he always chose the way himself from 2 or 3 possible routes just before leaving. He used to do this in spite of the fact that the route from the Kremlin to Kuntsevo was fairly short, and the choice was therefore very limited. Another thing he used to do was to strictly forbid anyone to remove the snow from the area near the windows of his dacha. He liked to see the virgin whiteness of the snow because he was afraid of everybody, and it was much easier to see any tracks. Khrushchev recalled how one day Stalin had said that, "Sometimes I don't even trust myself, let alone you."
The terror spreads far outside Moscow. The Soviet provincial world is shaken by the arrest of men the propaganda machine has built into gods. And with the destabilizing impact of their confessions of treachery and plots to murder comes a new infection. Friend denounces friend, neighbor reports neighbor. The Soviet writer Isaac Babel, himself soon to die in forced labor, wrote, "Today, a man only talks freely with his wife at night with the blankets pulled over his head." For many Soviet citizens, it is a time when nightmares come true. The terror casts a long shadow. Madame Muklevich remembers playing in the courtyard of Stalin's showpiece, The House on the Embankment.
Мы еще очень любили играть в классики.
We like to play hopscotch. Once an old woman stopped and watched us playing, laughing and having fun. She watched us and then asked, "Do you live in this building?" We answered, "Yes, we live here." She said, "No one who lives in this building will be happy." And she pointed to the pillars and said, "Because these pillars are made from gravestones, gravestones from the cemetery. No one in this building will be happy. You mark my words. No one in this building will be happy."
И вот помяните мое слово. Счастья никому не будет.
In 1935, the privileged tenants see more than the Kremlin towers from the Embankment House windows. On the other side of the river, the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour stands white and immensely solid. It too seems to speak of a privileged status. Then one morning, workers begin to surround the cathedral with hoarding. Word spreads that icons and statuary are being removed. In the Embankment House, the privileged ask themselves, is it possible that Stalin intends to demolish one of Moscow's greatest monuments? But very few people are prepared even then to question what is happening. Chairman of the Economic Council, Minister Kuibyshev, whose death is yet another wrapped in mystery, is one of the few.
Он был против сноса храма Христа Спасителя.
He opposed the demolition of the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. He wrote to Stalin explaining how he felt, that it should not be demolished because not only did it have religious significance, but also great historical and cultural importance. There were frescoes painted by Makovsky, Vereshchagin, and sculptures by Claude and Fyodor Tolstoy. But his letter just irritated Stalin, and he wrote across it, "Comrade Kuibyshev, you do not understand the full scale of the political meaning of this action. I insist on the demolition of the Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. J. Stalin."
Чтобы храм Христа Спасителя был снесен. И Сталин.
Where Stalin is undermining the strength of his country by his aggression against its people, Adolf Hitler uses the Jews as scapegoats and sedulously cultivates unity among Germans. His object is rearmament and war. Evasion of the limits on German military power imposed by the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the Great War are not new. But now Hitler openly flaunts the treaty. Panzers developed on Russian training grounds are put into mass production. A new Luftwaffe is openly built with advanced fighter, bomber and transport aircraft design. By 1935, Hitler has announced conscription for an army of 36 modern divisions and put the nation onto a war economy basis. He leaves no doubt in anybody's mind that the ultimate target is living space in the East. Joseph Stalin chooses a different route. His ever-suspicious eyes turn towards the military. It is the last institution in the state that could challenge his leadership. Among the many military and political families living in the house on the embankment, Mikhail Tukhachevsky is an eminent and commanding figure. A former Tsarist officer of noble ancestry, he is now Marshal of the Red Army.
In the evening, the car would draw up outside the building, and Mikhail Tukhachevsky, in his uniform, looking so elegant and handsome, entered the apartment block. He was really very handsome. Everyone looked at him. And we, us children, playing hopscotch, always stopped to look at him.
Tukhachevsky was no angel. He was a man who had used gas to suppress the Tambov uprising. He had also suppressed the Kronstadt insurrection and had directed a number of Soviet punitive operations. One could never call someone who had been so sullied a saint.
But Tukhachevsky was undoubtedly an outstanding officer. His initiatives include the first paratroops and the first Soviet exercises in modern armored warfare. In the spring of 1937, information has passed to Stalin from Prague, suggesting Tukhachevsky was planning a coup d'etat. We know now that this was a German intelligence plant, carefully organized by Heydrich via a fake robbery from a document center in Berlin. Within less than a month, Yezhov feels able to compile a list of officers involved in a plot. From here, the so-called conspiracy widens at a terrifying rate. Vladilena, daughter of General Uberevich, remembers.
By the 11th, they had already been shot, but they were imprisoned first. Tukhachevsky, Yakir on the 29th of May, and Uberevich on the 30th.
Another senior officer, Gamanik, an upstairs neighbor, is given the grim choice: serve as judge or appear in court as a defendant.
On the 31st of May, Gamarnik shot himself. Gamarnik lived in the same building as us, in an apartment just above. And when he shot himself, my mother tried to prepare me for the worst by telling me that something terrible could happen to my father as well. I didn't know my father had been arrested. All of them were young, under 40. They were all people who were very young during the Civil War and were charmed by the idea of helping the Russian people.
Primakov, yet another tenant of the embankment house, is already under torture in the Lubyanka. At the trial, he will confess to treachery and offer the names of 70 officers working with the Germans.
One could say that by eliminating the people responsible for the country's defense, Stalin was conducting an act of state treachery. And what's more, he did these things in the full knowledge of the consequences.
Lawlessness has its own momentum. Even by Stalin's standards, due process is a farce. 2 weeks after Tukhachevsky is arrested, he is brought to a trial which lasts less than 4 hours, from 9 o'clock to lunchtime. Tukhachevsky, Uberevich, Primakov and 4 others are found guilty. On the night of June the 12th, 1937, all defendants are shot. Tukhachevsky's interrogation file, recovered from the archives, is stained with his blood. Tukhachevsky's death is the signal for the most concentrated bloodletting yet seen. Nearly half the whole command staff of the Army and Navy are murdered. As Stalin's crony, the incompetent Voroshilov, reported, the Red Army has been cleansed of more than 40,000 officers. Those left in the army staffs are totally paralyzed. All military initiative is destroyed.
All this led to a feeling that the country had been bled dry, and Germany knew this. And some of their officials were even heard to say, "What are the Russians doing? This is madness."
Adolf Hitler, the Austrian, Joseph Stalin, the Georgian, now face each other as the clock ticks away the last hours of peace in Europe. They each lead powerful nations, but Germany has been honed and tested. Its people are unified and confident. At what we can see now as the end of the first period of Stalin's rule, he has created a Soviet Union immensely more productive than the nation he inherited from Lenin, but the weaknesses are equally terrible. The Soviet Union has an army demoralized and rendered fearful. Its individuality and initiative dangerously crushed. Adolf Hitler, meanwhile, knows that victory in the coming struggle will go to the nation that is confident in its leaders, positive in its beliefs. His nation is prepared for war. But for the Soviet Union, the great question still hangs fire. In the crisis to come, will the people be able to put the horrors of the 1930s behind them? Will they be able to regain the courage, the commitment of their early faith? When war comes, will the people of the Soviet Union be prepared to fight? In the world beyond the Soviet Union, these are years when Europe marches to the beat of Adolf Hitler's drum. Already in 1936, just 3 years after he comes to power, Hitler has sent his as yet unprepared army to occupy the Rhineland, demilitarized by the Versailles Treaty, which concluded the Great War. It is his first, most dangerous step. A moment when, for Adolf Hitler, everything teeters on the edge. Even his position as Führer itself depends on the reaction of the Western Allies. We know now that he has ordered an immediate German retreat if French forces oppose them. He has taken a desperate risk to throw down an early challenge to Versailles, the treaty he came to power promising to break. But in this vital test of nerve, Britain and France failed to act. It is the first of many failures of Western nerve. Failures bound to give the leadership of the Soviet Union serious cause to reflect. Worse is the news of a pact signed by Germany and Japan, and later joined by Italy, a treaty which targets the Soviet Union. To Stalin, there could be no stronger sign of the reckless speed with which Hitler intends to move. In the Kremlin, the message is clear. The Versailles Treaty, that whole rearrangement of frontiers imposed on Europe by the victorious Western Allies, has now no more than a few years to live. There are too many disputed territories in Europe, too many claims and counterclaims. At home, Stalin's leadership is unchallengeable. He relishes the title of Great Leader. But the Great Leader is tainted with a fatal sickness. His malady is not physical. It resides in an unrivaled greed for power, and festers with a paranoid distrust of every other human being.
And as you know, he died alone in his own self-made prison. He lived in a corridor in which there were 3 doors, which led to 3 separate apartments, each with their own bedrooms. And every morning he would telephone for breakfast, lunch or dinner, and every day they would bring him 3 separate breakfasts, lunches and dinners, and place one by each door, and then immediately leave, so that no one would know from which door he would take his breakfast. And that is how he lived. Hateful and hated.
The deathbed warning of Lenin and Trotsky's denunciation of Stalin as the gravedigger of the revolution have been chillingly justified in these years of arrest, murder, and enslavement of the Soviet people. Stalin has one single solution for all opposition to his will, and he sees foreigners, Westerners in particular, as people with the power to infect Soviet citizens with a nameless plague. For Stalin, this is reality. A squadron of the United States Navy visits the Far East Russian port of Vladivostok. Grigory Okonev was chief political officer of the Pacific Fleet. His nephew Ilya was a small boy at the time.
My uncle's fate was tragic. I myself was an involuntary witness of that unusual event in Vladivostok. A squadron of American warships, consisting of one battle cruiser, Augusta, and 4 destroyers, was paying a visit of friendship. The squadron was under the command of Admiral Ernell. The visit lasted 4 days. American sailors roamed freely in the city, talking to the people, exchanging souvenirs, taking photographs. The Americans allowed the locals free access to the cruiser, showing it to anyone who wanted to see. I was there with my uncle, and Admiral Ernell met him personally. The Admiral took me around and showed me the gun turrets and plane decks. It was a mighty vessel. When it came into the bay, our ships that were anchored there were bobbing up and down like floats.
This is an official visit, sanctioned by the authorities, the sort of visit paid by navies all over the world. We shall never know who brought it to Stalin's notice.
When the American squadron left Vladivostok, mass arrests of personnel in our Pacific Fleet began. Sailors were accused of being recruited by American intelligence and becoming American spies. Furthermore, when I managed with great difficulty to get hold of the 150-page file on Okonev from the KGB, I saw that all the evidence was false because it had obviously been dictated to the prisoners by their interrogators. I also obtained his death certificate. It said that the cause of death was by shooting.
Stalin's reckless savagery now leaves no area of Soviet life untouched. Literature and even science must conform. Nikolai Ivanovich Vavilov is a world-renowned geneticist, but Stalin prefers the theories of Lysenko, a Marxist charlatan.
Stalin had made an appointment for 10 o'clock in the evening. Father was there at the right time. But he was made to wait 2 hours, till midnight. Stalin did not receive him for 2 hours. At last, after midnight, or even later, he was called. He went in and greeted Stalin. And Stalin started to ask him, "So, you are still busy with the flowers and berries and all that botany nonsense which is no use to anybody?" This prompted my father to deliver a lecture on the subject. Stalin listened in silence and then said, "You may leave, Citizen Vavilov." And that was the end of the meeting. It had a most sinister meaning. We now know that they were already planning to arrest my father in 1939.
The trials of Marshals Tukhachevsky and Yakir are followed with new arrests of high-ranking military figures. Rokossovsky, later to be one of the war's outstanding generals, is thrown into Kresty prison and tortured as a Polish spy. Marshals Blucher and Yegorov are dragged from the Lubyanka, Blucher with one eye torn out during torture and put to death. Marshal Yegorov's daughter remembers the day of his arrest.
They dragged him into the room, 2 or 3 of them. Naturally, I rushed to him, started to tear at them and pull them away, shouting, "Don't touch my father." I was thrown on the bed. And father said, "Don't touch the child, you bastards." They tied his hands. He was a strong, well-built man, but they tied him up and took him away. After that, I don't remember. There's a gap in my memory. I don't remember that period. My next memory is the children's home. He was shot on the 23rd of February, Red Army Day. The army which he actually created, along with Yakir, Blucher, Tukhachevsky. Those marshals created the army, didn't they? It's just something you cannot grasp.
It is an unending litany of arrest, torture, confession, and execution. In early 1938, Molotov proposes a list of new ministers to the Supreme Soviet. Within 2 years of their appointments, they are all under arrest, executed, or have disappeared. Now Stalin turns back to the people he contemptuously calls the little cogs, the broad masses of the Soviet peasantry. In the countryside, age-old harvest celebrations are hijacked by the party and recorded in propaganda film to persuade peasants everywhere that life is good. But peasants know the truth because they live it. The new serfdom refuses them permission to move and demands peasants pay almost twice as much for basic necessities as the people in the towns. And men like the young Khrushchev in the Ukraine are bringing to the provinces an epidemic of terror no longer under control. "I have sent you 18,000 enemies of the people," Khrushchev boasts in one cable to Stalin. He signs it, "Loving you, Nikita Khrushchev." Among many, peasants and town dwellers alike, feelings of explosive frustration build against the regime. They know that they are impotent to act. In some, it is a deadly rage against Stalin personally. Vladilena Uberevich, whose father was shot during the First Army Purge.
It was my dream to kill Stalin. I was a young girl of 18, a student at the institute, and I used to walk along the street dreaming of how I would kill Stalin. I hated him with such bitterness. The children of the people he had killed were growing up. They were getting close to 20 years old. They were dangerous.
When Stalin lifts his head from the arrest warrants and execution orders that cover his desk, he finds, abroad, he faces more intractable problems. In Spain, civil war rages between nationalist forces under Franco and the Republican government. Communism and fascism, the two totalitarian ideologies, are in open confrontation. Both dictatorships see the diversionary value of a Spanish war. Hitler to allow Germany to continue with its rearmament, Stalin because, with the spotlight on Spain, his purges pass with less foreign notice. Both dictators act swiftly. Hitler sends 8,000 men of the Air, Land, Condor Legion to support Italy's massive aid to Franco. Stalin will dispatch fighter pilots, nearly 1,000 aircraft, tanks and tank crews to fight on the Republican side. The war becomes a weapons testing ground for the two nations. In the air over Madrid, Soviet and German pilots clash for the first time. The military victory will go to Franco's side, but the Soviet propaganda victory is considerable. Self-confident and myopic intellectuals in the West see only one dictator, Hitler. Tens of thousands claim membership of the Communist Party. Others from a world of privilege, like Kim Philby, are recruited as agents by the NKVD. In Spain, the NKVD is ever present as agents who accompany Stalin's aide. Operating behind Republican lines, they extend his reign of terror, eliminating Trotskyists, anarchists, and anyone else who opposes Stalinist policy. And when they return to Moscow, Stalin's ruthless pattern is repeated. The NKVD men and most of the senior military advisors are executed in their turn. The well-known Soviet journalist Mikhail Koltsov is one of the early victims. The whole country has been following his reports from Spain, but he is suddenly called back to Moscow. His brother, the cartoonist Boris Yefimov, describes Koltsov's meeting with Stalin.
In May of 1937, it was already 1937, he was summoned by Stalin. Besides Stalin, there were 4 others: Molotov, Voroshilov, Kaganovich, and Yezhov. Stalin began to ask questions about the situation in Spain. How are things there? What is so-and-so doing? But then, as my brother told me, Stalin began to behave strangely, in an affected manner. He stood beside my brother, put his hand on his heart and said, "How do they address you in Spanish? Miguel or something?" Koltsov, my brother, answered, "Miguel, Comrade Stalin." So Stalin went on, "Don Miguel, we honorable Spaniards thank you for your excellent report." Koltsov said, "I serve the Soviet Union, Comrade Stalin." And that was that. But when he was already by the door, Stalin suddenly called after him, "And do you own a revolver, Comrade Koltsov?" My brother was surprised and answered, "Yes, I do, Comrade Stalin." "And you are not planning to shoot yourself with it?" "No, Comrade Stalin, I never even thought of it." "Well, that's excellent, Don Miguel. All the best then, Comrade Koltsov." So Koltsov went. That's the story. It can be explained in different ways, and I've got my own explanation. My brother and I talked about it and thought about it, but we didn't take it seriously, thinking it was some sort of black joke or an eccentricity.
Mikhail Koltsov was arrested by the NKVD and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. When the cartoonist went to ask what his brother's 10-year sentence really meant, the judge swore it meant exactly what it said: 10 years imprisonment.
So I asked, "Did you judge him personally?" He said, "Yes, I did." And then I asked, "How did he look?" Ulrich said, "Well, just as usual, perhaps a bit drawn." It was all pure mockery, because my brother had already been shot by then.
At the League of Nations, Stalin tests the other course. Maxim Litvinov, Soviet foreign minister, and Maisky, Russian ambassador in London, labor to bring the Soviet Union closer to Britain and France. Peace, Maisky warns the West, is indivisible. But mistrust between Stalin and the West is great. Now Germany, with a series of stunning military and diplomatic successes, changes the face of Europe. In March 1938, German troops enter Austria. For Hitler, the Austrian, another stunning triumph. He is returned as ruler to the country of his birth. the country whose police files for the moment still record him as wanted for evading the draft. It is Czechoslovakia's turn next. Here, Hitler claims ethnic Germans in the Sudetenland area are being savagely persecuted. With threats against Prague, he precipitates an international crisis. Before the year's end, France and Britain, with Italy mediating, have forced Czechoslovakia to concede the German-speaking part of its territory to the Reich. To Chamberlain, it is a triumph. Peace for our time. To the Soviet Union, it is a measure of how far the Western Allies will go to placate Hitler. Winston Churchill says, the governments of France and Britain had to choose between shame and war. They have chosen shame, but they will reap war. Hitler returns in triumph to Berlin after signing the Munich Agreement. For Czechoslovakia, abandoned by her allies, the end comes quickly. Before the fateful year of 1939 is 3 months old, Hitler, burning with reckless confidence, marches his army into the remainder of the country. Czechoslovakia is declared no longer to exist. As a minor postscript, no more than symbolic of Germany's new power, Lithuania immediately accedes to Hitler's demand for the return of the Baltic seaport of Memel. In 6 years, he has dramatically redrawn the map of Central Europe. The Versailles Treaty is now in tatters. It is almost time for Hitler to look towards his second major object, the acquisition of Lebensraum, extra living space for Germany in the east. But expansion eastwards must involve war with Poland. And if the German border with Poland is to be reshaped, why should the Soviet border not be similarly altered? Both dictators, therefore, have an unacknowledged common interest in the destruction of Poland, though in public they flaunt their differences. And the propaganda machines of the two adversaries, Hitler and Stalin, relentlessly denounce each other. March 1939. In Moscow, delegates to the 18th Party Congress assemble. Stalin hails a great achievement. 60% of the delegates to the last conference have been murdered. Behind the high-profile deaths in Moscow, there is another deeper disaster. In the last year, 1937 to 38, there have been between 7 and 8 million arrests, and at least 1 million executions. At Kuropaty near Minsk, one secret NKVD burial site contains 30,000 bodies. For the NKVD killing squads and the so-called boxers, thugs who specialize in torture and interrogation, communism is now no more than a cynical indulgence in sadism. Now, on the 5th day, delegates to the Congress hear the stunning news of the German annexation of the rest of Czechoslovakia. Abandoned by her Western allies, the Czech government has ordered its people not to resist. The people of Europe are now haunted by the threat of war. At the public rostrum, Hitler denies any aggressive intention.
Unabhängiger Nationen nicht angreifen, dafür in Frage kommen nun Finnland, Lettland, Litauen, Estland, Norwegen, Schweden, Dänemark, Niederlande, Belgien, Großbritannien, Irland, Frankreich, Portugal, Spanien, die Schweiz, Liechtenstein, Luxemburg, Polen, Ungarn, Rumänien, Jugoslawien, Russland, Bulgarien, Türkei, Irak, Arabien, Syrien, Palästina.
But it is not difficult to guess that Poland is Hitler's next objective. Stalin's choice is stark. If the spoils of the breakup of Versailles are to be seized, logic demands that Stalin must share them with his avowed enemy. The USSR will not obtain a piece of Poland by fighting alongside the West to defend Poland's borders. It is a stunningly immoral idea, but there is no doubt that it is in Joseph Stalin's mind. As a first move, he allows Litvinov to make one final attempt to reassemble the idea of collective security, in the certain knowledge that Poland, proud, stubborn, will refuse any joint declaration which allows Soviet troops to come onto their territory to give them aid. While pressure mounts in the West, there is at least good news from the East, where the Japanese have been prodding at the border of the Soviet Union.
After we had been camped for 4 days, we saw that the Japanese samurai were moving up on the border. Lieutenant Markalin ordered us to get ready. The Japanese samurai crossed the border and opened fire with automatic weapons. Lieutenant Markalin led us into attack for Comrade Stalin and the motherland.
It is the first appearance on the international stage for the young, forthright General Gorgy Zhukov, when he heavily defeats the Japanese Sixth Army at Kholkhin Gol and effectively secures the back door of the Soviet Union. But in Europe, there is no breathing space in the lead-up to war. German rearmament is displayed in parades and flypasts that culminate in Hitler's 50th birthday celebration in April 1939. As Stalin ponders which way to turn, France puts her faith in the Maginot Line, a gigantically costly string of concrete and steel forts facing Germany. Great Britain in her fleet, but Stalin is now ready to move forward with a realignment that will astound the world. Pressure of events keeps the gestation period short. At the 1939 May Day parade, sharp-eyed German diplomats record the fact that the Jewish and pro-Western Foreign Minister Maxim Litvinov is not on the podium. When the following day Hitler is informed that Stalin has replaced Litvinov by Molotov as foreign minister, it is, he tells his generals, like a volley from a gun. The two dictators speak the same language. In public, each system continues to condemn the other. In private, the diplomats are beginning to hammer out a deal, a turnabout that will shock the world. It is certain that at this point, Stalin knows that Hitler has decided to invade Poland. Equally certain that Stalin intends to share the spoils. In July, Molotov tells the German ambassador to Moscow that the Soviet Union seeks better relations with Germany. On August the 11th, an Anglo-French military mission arrives in Moscow to discuss cooperation. They are 3 months too late, perhaps even 3 years too late. Within days, Ribbentrop stresses speed as preliminary negotiations between Germany and the Soviet Union begin. But Hitler is not prepared to invade Poland without a guarantee of support from the Soviet Union. On August the 20th, the Führer shows his hand by intervening personally, cabling to Stalin the suggestion that Ribbentrop should come to Moscow in 2 days' time. Stalin agrees. On August the 23rd at Moscow airport, they await the momentous arrival of the German foreign minister. But there is a long, worrying delay. Only when Molotov, baffled, sends for information do they discover the reason. The plane carrying the Germans to their momentous rendezvous has been forced down, fired on by Soviet border defenses. Amid feasting and toasts, the Non-Aggression Pact is drawn up and signed immediately. Stalin raises his glass to Germany's finest son, Adolf Hitler. The two dictators have publicly clasped hands. It is an extraordinary coup de théâtre. A betrayal of millions. But, of course, the world is not told all. The Non-Aggression Pact has secret, deeply sinister protocols. Clauses to divide Poland between Germany and the Soviet Union, to assign the Baltic states to Soviet rule.
What do all these protocols contain? I'll run through them briefly. The additional secret protocol on spheres of interest of Germany and the USSR, the interpretation of the supplementary protocol, the protocol on the possible resettlement of population, the secret protocol concerning possible changes, essentially how to divide the Baltic states, concerning suppression of dissent on territory of divided Poland, the protocol on Germany's waiver of claims to Lithuanian territory. We agreed to give $75 million to Germany, marks or dollars, for that piece of Lithuania.
A map made on the next Ribbentrop visit, signed by Stalin himself, shows the division of spoils.
These are obviously historic documents. They have been kept in complete concealment since 1939 because they represent a final verdict on Soviet diplomacy, which negotiated with the Western democracies for several months in 1939 and achieved nothing, and then sealed a friendship agreement with the fascists in the space of 2 days. Of course, both the fascists and the Western democracies were using cunning. It was a big game, diplomatic bargaining. But the Soviet Union, Soviet diplomacy, Stalin and Molotov, they showed historic immorality, immorality to the utmost degree.
Stalin and Hitler, locked in hatred and envy, but at the same time in a strange parallel admiration, have stunned the world. This is not a pact to avoid war. It is a treaty to make war. In London, Paris and Washington, there is consternation. London, at long last, makes it clear that it has abandoned appeasement forever. Within 2 days, Britain signs a treaty with Poland, binding Britain to go to war if she is attacked. In the Soviet Union, there is an immediate cessation of anti-Hitler propaganda. The word fascist is even banned in Stalin's labor camps as a term of abuse.
Such acute changes of policy, when the word fascist suddenly disappeared, it was extraordinary. And the next time we heard the word fascist was in Molotov's speech on the 23rd of June, the day after the invasion. And it sounded strange when he said, "those fascist rulers," and so on. It was only then that we realized that fascism did exist after all.
Soviet citizens are bemused, but relieved that war with Germany has been avoided. As yet, they know nothing of the secret protocol, but the events of the next few days will allow the more astute to guess. The ground has been prepared by Nazi propaganda, as it was prepared in Czechoslovakia. On the last day of August, Goebbels claims Poland has attacked German border forces. The bodies are executed prisoners dressed in Polish uniform. On a device of such transparent banality does the Second World War begin. Hitler goes to the front at the town of Kulm to oversee his victory. On the morning and early afternoon of September the 3rd, Chamberlain in London honours his guarantee to Poland and declares war on Germany. An announcement from Paris follows within hours. Poland suffers the first blitzkrieg. the Polish forces fight back with great courage against hopeless odds. The Luftwaffe bombs Warsaw at will. Soviet forces now move into eastern Poland. There can be no resistance. From Minsk, Stalin allows the Luftwaffe to fly missions against the Polish forces. German and Soviet generals coordinate the action. Within 6 weeks, it is all over. Soviet and German troops march past before General Guderian and Soviet Colonel Krivushin at the fortress of Brest. In Poland, where ethnic Belarusians and Ukrainians have welcomed the Red Army with flowers, the hideous pattern of arrest and deportation begins. Known anti-communists, priests, army officers. It is now certain that this is the period of the great NKVD massacre of Polish officers at Katyn Forest near Smolensk. Denied for so long by Soviet governments, there is no longer any doubt that the massacre was by NKVD troops. Kaczynski Beck has lived near the site of the massacre since he was born in 1918.
Yes, this zone was closed and no one was allowed to enter it. It was only opened up 3 years ago. At that time, we brought Poles here and they were unloaded from the carriages and taken to Kuzikory in the forest. The guards took them down there. The wagons were called ravens, black ravens. The wagons were taken straight to the carriages, carriages with bars on the windows, and from there they were taken away. Religious people, military people, even civilians with suitcases and bags, even dogs.
How long did it last?
About a month, I reckon. And they didn't bring them every day. No, not every day.
Where from?
I don't know.
Were there any rumors as to what happened to them?
There were rumors that they were shot there, but nobody knows.
Only now is the order to shoot the officers revealed. Signed by Stalin, Molotov, Mikoyan, Voroshilov and Beria, the exact number of deaths has never been established. Some 4,000 corpses are eventually found in the forest out of a total of between 10,000 and 20,000 Polish officers who disappeared without trace from Soviet camps in the area. Neither Hitler nor Stalin see good reason for Poland to exist. While Hitler flies to Warsaw to review his troops, Stalin offers his congratulations and seizes what he takes to be an easy opportunity. In November, he invades Finland to be met with an initial defeat at the hands of the small Finnish army. The impact of Stalin's purges are now glaringly apparent for the world to see. Stalin's onslaught on the army has rendered it barely able to fight even a local war. To Hitler, the poor performance by the Red Army in Finland is further evidence of the inferiority of Slav to Aryan and of the vulnerability of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, in public, the pivotal relationship blossoms. As the year 1939 ends, Hitler cables Stalin, I would like to extend my true, sincere greetings on your 60th anniversary.
I propose we raise our glasses to Comrade Stalin, who leads us along the bright road to communism.
Stalin replies without irony, "The friendship between us, sealed in blood, has every reason to be long-lasting." Soviet and Nazi hands are tightly clasped. Russian raw materials flow westward. At the border where the rail gauge changes, grain and oil are transferred to German wagons. As a final act of abject appeasement, Stalin returns to the Gestapo German communists who have fled to Moscow. On the vital Western Front, the phony war continues. Allied forces remain on the defensive, the French behind their unbreachable Maginot Line. Parcels from home relieve the boredom. Hitler is content to fight on one front at a time. In May 1940, the Germans launch a spectacular Western offensive, invading the Low Countries and splitting the French and British armies with rapacious panzer thrusts. Goebbels proclaims Moscow gives us every support. As each of the small capitals of Northwest Europe fall, Stalin closes down the Soviet embassies, a tacit recognition that might is right. In London, Chamberlain is called on to resign. Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister and struggles to rally France and Britain against the spectre of a devastating defeat. But the German army is unstoppable. Millions of civilians flee northern France. The French government leave Paris amid scenes of chaos on the roads. At Dunkirk, the British Navy evacuates 330,000 British and French soldiers under fire. The prominent choreographer Moiseev recalls a concert in Moscow at this time when Stalin approached him and asked,
Stalin said to me, "Can you put on a show depicting the defeat of Britain and France?" There was a deathly silence, and everyone understood that the conversation had taken a new turn. Stalin grinned and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Okay, you just sit there," and went off. And that was that. But this episode surprised everybody. And I immediately thought, what is he talking about? If Britain and France are defeated, we will be left completely alone with Hitler.
Paris falls. And the French sign a punitive armistice. At Hitler's insistence, the same rail carriage is brought to Compiègne, where the French had taken Germany's surrender in the First World War. It is a result Hitler has dreamed of since he was in the trenches. Berlin celebrates the fall of France, where vast new industrial and agricultural riches have fallen under German control. But there are spoils for Stalin too. In the north, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia are annexed, again in accordance with the secret agreements made with Hitler. In all, Stalin has gained 175,000 square miles of territory and 20 million new inhabitants for the Soviet Union. As the NKVD move in, thousands of his new subjects are shot. Tens of thousands more are immediately arrested and transported to swell the workforce in the Gulag. But in the midst of foreign policy triumph, Stalin can always spare time for old enmities. Denied asylum in many countries of the West, Leon Trotsky, Stalin's old rival, is now safe, as he believes, in Mexico, far from the grasp of the NKVD. He is nevertheless tracked down and murdered by a hired killer, Raymond Mercado, an ice pick in the victim's brain. Yet, for the Soviet-German special relationship, there are already clouds on the horizon. Molotov goes to Germany to discuss spheres of influence between Germany, the Soviet Union, Italy and Japan. In fact, as we now know, the Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka has already been told that Germany will expect Japan's involvement in any war against the Soviet Union, and that Hitler has already signed Instruction 18, ordering preparations for the attack on the Soviet Union to continue. But the Japanese are not to be tempted. Tokyo decides it would prefer to keep its own back door to the Soviet Union firmly locked. Matsuoka therefore flies to Moscow to sign a treaty of neutrality. There are more toasts and formal poses. And Stalin accords Matsuoka the signal honor of a personal send-off. But Stalin now is a rabbit caught in headlights. On the day that Stalin signs a pact of friendship with Yugoslavia, Hitler attacks in the Balkans. Is this to be the last blitzkrieg, or will the Soviet Union be next? What is certain is that if Hitler follows Yugoslavia with an attack on the Soviet Union, Stalin's gamble to grab the spoils of a disintegrating Versailles will have failed disastrously. It will have left the Soviet Union isolated, without an ally in the world. Stalin has made too many bitter enemies in the party and the army. His own position as leader, his life is in the balance. He cannot even admit the possibility that he has miscalculated, that Hitler is about to attack. But details of German intentions are coming from all quarters. Churchill, with the German High Command code available to him, informs Stalin by secret cable. Outstanding Soviet agents in Britain, the United States, and even in Germany itself confirm that there will be an attack. The Soviet intelligence network in Switzerland gives June the 22nd as the attack date. Richard Zorger, working from the German embassy in Tokyo, confirms it.
The Germans started to move troops and station them in Finland, at strategic points close to the border with the Soviet Union.
And even as German tanks assemble along the Soviet border, Stalin's monstrous echo, NKVD chief Lavrenti Beria, orders that secret agents who confirm news of the German attack are to be turned into prison dust for supplying systematic misinformation.
On the 16th of June 1941, this agent came to a meeting. He was very agitated and immediately informed me that Hitler's Germany would attack the Soviet Union in the next few days, and he even told me the date.
From Luftwaffe officer Schulze-Boysen, at the heart of Goering's high command, a warning of an imminent attack is forwarded to the Kremlin. But Stalin rejects the information in the crudest terms. This mother-loving swine is passing on disinformation, J. Stalin. This is now willful blindness, the blindness of desperation. As the fateful hour approaches, Stalin rejects requests from Zhukov and Timoshenko to move the troops on the border to defensive positions. Throughout the Soviet Union, young people celebrate at graduation parties. At 11 p.m. on the night of June the 21st, a German deserter, Alfred Liskov, crosses to the Soviet side with the warning that the attack is coming in 5 hours' time. Like all other warnings, it is ignored. The graduation parties continue deep into the night. Drinking, dancing, talking, flirting. Despite all the evidence, the leader of the Soviet people dares not allow himself to believe that he has disastrously miscalculated. On this night of all nights, Joseph Stalin, who has chosen to ignore all warnings, retires to bed at 3 a.m., his usual time.